November 1942. A German officer makes his way through the cold, mist-drenched streets of Copenhagen. The lamps above him flicker in the fog. Boots echo softly on the cobblestones. He adjusts his collar against the chill, unaware that these will be the last steps he ever takes. He never hears the gunshot. He never sees the assassin. To witnesses, nothing happens at all. Yet, in the span of a heartbeat, the officer collapses silently onto the stone pavement, and the man who killed him is already disappearing into the maze of side streets, weapon hidden, footsteps muffled, identity erased. The murder weapon looks nothing like a pistol. No polished steel, no familiar silhouette, no trigger guard, no magazine protruding from the grip. Instead, it resembles a rough metal tube salvaged from a workshop. By any conventional measure, it is the ugliest firearm ever fielded by British forces. But in the shadows of Europe, it becomes something else entirely. The most effective covert killing device of the entire war. This was the Welrod, a weapon designed not for firefights or trenches, but for a colder, quieter war. A war conducted in alleys, safe houses, and occupied train stations. The Welrod turned the space between a coat sleeve and a target's skull into the most dangerous territory in Europe. Its sound signature was so faint that, in many assassinations, the victim fell dead before anyone even realized a shot had been fired. Before we continue deeper into this hidden chapter of World War II history, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us keep uncovering the stories that were never meant to be told. And trust me, what comes next will only get darker. Now, back to the problem British intelligence faced. In 1941, the newly formed Special Operations Executive, the secret army Churchill had ordered to set Europe ablaze, was expanding rapidly. Wherever German boots marched, SOE agents followed. They infiltrated France, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and beyond. They built resistance cells out of farmers, students, shopkeepers, anyone willing to push back. But sabotage plans and intelligence gathering were only part of the mission. At times, an obstacle had to be removed, quietly, surgically, without alerting the occupation forces. And here, SOE hit a wall. Their assassination tools were primitive at best. A knife demanded courage and proximity. One wrong move, and the agent died instead. A garrote required strength and positioning, and in winter clothing it became nearly useless. Poison was unreliable, slow, and could draw suspicion if the victim lived long enough to raise alarm. What SOE needed was brutally specific, a firearm that could kill at arm's length, without sounding like a firearm. Silenced pistols technically existed before the war, but they were clumsy, inconsistent, and dangerously loud by clandestine standards. Their suppressors burned out quickly. Their shots carried too far. Their mechanical noise exposed operators. In some cases, the suppressor itself was larger than the gun. If an SOE agent used one in a narrow street or cramped room, everyone within several houses might hear the echo. The British had the agents. They had the targets. They had the mission. What they didn't have was a weapon worthy of the shadows, and that was about to change. The early attempts at quiet weapons proved just how far the British still had to go. The suppressed Sten gun, for example, did reduce muzzle noise, but only down to around 130 decibels, the acoustic equivalent of someone operating a jackhammer inside a tunnel. Useful for disguising the sharp crack of the shot, yes, but useless for a mission where a single misheard sound could mean death. Standard pistol suppressors of the era weren't much better. Even the best designs could only drag the sound signature to approximately 120 decibels, still loud enough to ring through open streets, bounce between stone walls, and alert anyone within dozens of meters. In other words, these weapons were quieter, not silent. But SOE wasn't looking for quieter. They needed the impossible. They needed a firearm that could be discharged inside an apartment building, in a stairwell, or inside a crowded cafe, and disappear beneath the ambient noise of footsteps, voices, and clinking glasses. A weapon that could fire, kill, and vanish before anyone even turned their head. It also had to be compact enough to hide beneath a coat, simple enough that it could never betray its user with a mechanical failure, and reliable enough for operators who only got one chance, one shot, one heartbeat. The specification bordered on fantasy. The task ultimately landed in the hands of a small, brilliant team at the Inter-Services Research Bureau, Station 9, a secret workshop tucked away in Welwyn Garden City, north of London. This was no ordinary weapons laboratory. It functioned more like a war-era skunkworks, a place where strange ideas took shape in metal, rubber, and chemistry. Major Hugh Reeves, a man whose wartime contributions would remain buried under layers of secrecy for decades, led the design effort alongside a handful of engineers whose names have largely disappeared into classified archives. They approached the problem not like traditional gunsmiths, but like physicists dissecting the anatomy of sound. Because to silence a gunshot, they needed to silence three separate noises: the explosive release of propellant gases, the sonic crack of a supersonic bullet slicing through air, the metallic noise of the weapon cycling. To create a weapon suitable for true covert killing, all three had to be neutralized. Standard 9mm parabellum ammunition leaves the barrel at around 350 meters per second, well above the speed of sound, approximately 343 meters per second. This guaranteed a supersonic crack, regardless of how well the gases were suppressed. The engineers realized the bullet wasn't the issue, the speed was. So they took ordinary 9mm rounds and reduced the propellant charge, dropping velocity to around 290 meters per second, below the sound barrier, stable in flight, whisper quiet. This single adjustment removed one of the three major sound sources. Semi-automatic pistols produce a shocking amount of sound from slides cycling, brass casings, ejecting springs, snapping new rounds, chambering. For a silent kill, this clatter was unacceptable. So Reeves's team made a radical choice. They removed the semi-automatic function entirely. The Welrod's action was a simple, manual, knurled bolt at the rear. The shooter fired, then rotated and drew back the bolt to eject the spent casing, manually chambering the next round. Slow? Yes. Silent? Absolutely. Noise source number 2, eliminated. The greatest challenge remained, the blast of high-pressure gases erupting behind the bullet. This is where the Welrod became revolutionary. Unlike modern suppressors that attach to a barrel, the Welrod's suppressor was the barrel. Nearly 2/3 of the weapon consisted of baffles, chambers, and internal pathways designed to force hot gases to expand, cool, slow dissipate, before exiting. Fired, the shot didn't sound like a gun at all, more like a hand clap, a cough, a book dropped on a carpet. Operators reported that even at a few meters, the sound blended so naturally into ambient noise that it was effectively invisible. The Welrod was not just a silenced pistol. It was a mathematical solution to killing quietly, and it was only the beginning. A conventional 9mm pistol unleashes a violent report of roughly 160 decibels, loud enough to cause instant hearing damage and echo down city streets. By contrast, the Welrod produced a sound signature of approximately 73 decibels. That is not the sound of a firearm. That is the sound of a car door closing, a book dropped on a wooden floor, a footstep on a stairwell. At a distance of just 10 meters, the noise faded even further, dissolving into whatever ambient sounds filled the environment. Passing footsteps, distant conversations, a truck rumbling by, a door shutting in another room. In an urban setting, it did not stand out. It simply disappeared. The weapon itself was almost comically plain. Only 14 inches long, it resembled something scavenged from a maintenance shed. The grip was nothing more than a rubber-wrapped cylinder, which conveniently hid a 6-round magazine. Later, models upgraded to 8 rounds. From the front extended what looked like a length of blackened plumbing pipe. No curves, no polish, no elegance. There wasn't even a trigger guard, just a small, curved trigger protruding from the underside. The fixed front blade and rear notch were intentionally crude. The Welrod was not built for distance shots, impressive marksmanship, or battlefield engagements. Its effective range was about 23 meters, but its true purpose lay much closer. This was a weapon meant for hallways, stairwells, alleys, and cellars. A pistol designed to be pressed into the fabric of a coat, into a rib cage, or fired across the width of a cramped apartment. At these intimate distances, accuracy was not the priority. Silence was, and in that category, the Welrod exceeded every expectation placed upon it. Production quietly began in late 1942. The exact numbers have never been fully revealed, even after decades of declassification efforts. Estimates range wildly, from 2,800 to as many as 14,000 units, a level of uncertainty created deliberately. Serial numbering was intentionally randomized to obscure true production totals. Paperwork was kept sparse. Much of what did exist was burned or locked away. By early 1943, the first Welrods found their way into occupied Europe. They arrived through nighttime parachute drops, undercover shipments, and clandestine supply routes feeding the resistance networks of France, Denmark, Belgium, and beyond. And almost immediately, the pistol earned a reputation. Among the maquis in France, it became the instrument of executive actions, a chilling euphemism for the quiet removal of enemy officers, interrogators, brutal collaborators, and informants who endangered entire resistance cells. German officers known for cruelty toward civilians often met their end in empty courtyards or narrow alleys, their bodies discovered with no witnesses and no sound reported. Collaborators who had betrayed safe houses and underground operatives simply stopped appearing. The Welrod made possible a level of covert precision that conventional firearms could never achieve. It allowed assassinations in conditions where a single audible gunshot would have doomed the entire operation and everyone involved. It was more than a weapon. It was a scalpel, cold, silent, and unmistakably effective. And its story was only getting darker. One of the most striking field reports involving the Welrod comes from occupied Paris. A target was removed inside a crowded cafe at lunchtime. Waiters carrying trays, customers talking over each other, chairs scraping against the floor. The assassin stood up, slipped the weapon back into a coat sleeve, and calmly walked out into the bustling street. No scream, no recoil of panic. Patrons continued eating while the victim quietly slumped over. It was only minutes later, when the body cooled and the table went silent, that anyone realized a killing had occurred. Across occupied Europe, similar stories accumulated. In Denmark, the Holger Danske resistance group used the Welrod with ruthless precision. Their targets were Danish collaborators, Gestapo informants, and German intelligence officers whose actions had endangered countless civilians. The weapon's near-perfect silence allowed operations to take place in broad daylight, sometimes on open streets or stairwells where any conventional firearm would have triggered immediate retaliation. In Norway, SOE sabotage teams relied on the Welrod during high-risk demolition missions. Guards positioned near hydroelectric facilities and rail depots could be quietly removed before they had time to shout. Those few seconds of confusion, when a patrol realized a comrade had fallen but heard no sound, were often the only window the saboteurs needed to finish their work and vanish into the snow. The psychological pressure on German occupation forces was enormous. Soldiers assigned to quiet duty began to understand that silence itself was not safety. A calm hallway might conceal a threat. A peaceful cafe might hide a resistance operative. Informants, already despised, became harder to recruit. Potential collaborators hesitated when they heard rumors that betrayal could mean death delivered with no warning, no echo, not even a gasp. If you're finding this deep dive compelling, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now, let us examine how the Welrod compared to what other nations tried to build. German engineers did produce suppressed weapons during the war, but none were designed for the same mission profile. The Walther PPK could accept a screw-on suppressor, reducing sound to around 115 decibels, a modest improvement, but still very much recognizable as gunfire. German suppressor doctrine focused on reducing muzzle signature for snipers, not enabling an assassin to fire a round inside a stairwell full of people without being noticed. On the American side, the Office of Strategic Services fielded the high-standard HDM, a suppressed .22 caliber pistol. Impressively quiet at roughly 90 decibels, it was the closest competitor to the Welrod, but the HDM suffered from one crippling limitation: power. The .22 round often required multiple hits to ensure a kill, and in winter months, heavy coats could disrupt penetration entirely. Operators trusted it, but they did not depend on it. The Welrod, firing a reduced charge 9mm round, offered something neither side had managed to combine: exceptional silence and reliable stopping power. On paper, the results were unmistakable. Welrod, approximately 73 decibels, 9mm stopping power. OSS HDM, approximately 90 decibels, .2 caliber German suppressed pistols, rarely better than 115 decibels. In the cold mathematics of covert elimination, the Welrod stood alone. The Welrod's integrated suppressor used rubber wipes, thin discs that sealed around the bullet as it passed. These degraded over time, especially after multiple shots. Eventually, sound levels would rise and accuracy would suffer. But for the mission profiles the Welrod was built for, single-shot, close-range eliminations, this limitation mattered little. It remained a specialist's tool, designed for moments where one shot changed the fate of an entire resistance cell. Today, the Welrod is remembered not for beauty or craftsmanship, but for what it represented: a weapon that allowed ordinary people, teachers, tailors, farmers, clerks, to strike back against one of the most powerful armies in history, and slip away before anyone knew what had happened. If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts. Your support helps us bring more of these hidden chapters of wartime history to life.